So it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker of the next session of Vascular 2021, Joe Burgess, Neurology and Medicine at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine at New York. So, Dr. Varghese is one of the pioneers in the area of mobility and cognition. He developed the concept of the motor cognitive risk syndrome that demonstrates the close relationship between gait, motor function, and cognition, an under-researched area. Closer to where I am located, Dr. Joe Varghese trained in Bangalore, where I now work. And he has retained his research interest in South Asian Indian population. He heads a decade-long NIH-funded Kerala Einstein study that has also provided a lot of insights about small vessel disease, cognition, and motor risk. So it's indeed a privilege to listen to Dr. Joe Varghese present on Gait as a biomarker of VCI. Over to you.
Thank you, Suvarna, for that kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to see you from across this distance, so hopefully closer soon. I'd like to first of all, thank Raj and the rest of the organizers for inviting me to join. It's really been a pleasure monitoring the talks and presentations over the last day. And I was particularly gratified to see so many young investigators who are interested in this area. So the future is bright. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to share some thoughts and ideas about Gait as a biomarker of VCI. So if I could have the next slide. I'm briefly going to cover these areas. This might not be so controversial in this setting, but in many settings, to consider walking as a cognitive function is not generally accepted. So I'm going to use some examples from clinical observations to suggest that walking actually is a cognitive function. I'd then like to introduce you to this fairly recent syndrome. It's only been proposed 10 years ago, called motoric cognitive risk syndrome. And then, if time permits, just briefly talk about some clinical applications. Next slide. So my own interest in this whole area that walking actually might be a brain function stemmed from when I was a study clinician in an aging study called the Bronx Aging Study, based in the Bronx. And I started noticing that older adults who were not demented but had abnormal gaits were more likely to have impairments on their cognitive testing. And when we followed them up over time, it turned out that people with neurological gait abnormalities due to diseases like strokes or Parkinson's or just frontal disease were more likely to develop dementia, especially vascular dementia. Now, here's one of our participants who's trying to tandem walk. And as you can see right at the end, she almost loses her balance. After I show you, she didn't actually fall in that video. No older people were harmed in the making of any of these videos. So this led on to a path to understand if this sort of connection between gait, cognition, and dementia risk. So if I can have the next slide. Walking speed is a marker, I think, of vascular disease. In a study that we did in the Women's Health Initiative, which is a randomized clinical trial in the US involving postmenopausal women, we found that the slower women walked, the more likely they were to develop incident ischemic stroke, which is on the pathway to VCI. Next slide. We've also been interested in a paradigm called walking while talking. And this involves people walking a fixed distance while reciting alternate alphabets. This is a complex task because it not only strains the physical end, it also strains the cognitive end. Your brain literally has to divide its attention between the physical and cognitive tasks. In my own clinical setting, I often use this test to unearth subtle gait abnormalities. So if I think somebody has a subtle gait abnormality, I watch them walk and then I get them to walk and talk. And often this is helpful in unearthing latent abnormalities. Next slide. Walking while talking, as many investigators have shown, is a powerful predictor of falls, which is a major geriatric outcome and one that's closely associated with VCI. Next slide. It's also a predictor of multiple other geriatric outcomes like frailty, disability, and mortality, but of particular relevance to this audience in work done by one of my mentees, Dr. Seed, who's a geriatric psychiatrist. She also showed in one of our Bronx cohorts that the walking while talking speed predicted vascular dementia. So people who walk and talk slowly were at increased risk of developing vascular dementia. And generally, the clinical rule of thumb I use is if you slow down by a third or so while walking and talking, that's abnormal. Or if you actually have to stop to think of the next letter while walking and talking, that's not a good sign. Next slide. Here, I'm going to show you a setup that we use in our lab to probe a bit more detail into this walking while talking phenomenon. So here's one of our participants who's cognitively normal and is otherwise healthy, who's walking on an instrumented walkway, and you can see her footfalls appearing on the top left. She's also attached to a functional near-infrared spectroscopy equipment, which measures prefrontal activation. It measures the level of oxygenation and deoxygenation in the prefrontal areas of the brain. So I'm sure most of you would agree that this looks like more or less a normal walking performance. And if you keep in mind the level of activation you're seeing in the bottom left in those fNIR sensors, we're going to look at the same woman now trying to do a walking while talking test. So if I could have the next slide. So now we have the same participant, but this time she's attempting to walk while reciting alternate letters. So immediately you see that she slows down. Her steps become smaller, wider, and slower. And occasionally she sort of stumbles or stops. And mind you, this is a normal participant. And if you could compare in your mind's eye the level of activation you're seeing on the fNIRS, it's actually twice as, it's not as twice, but it's higher than what is required during normal walking, indicating that this is actually a cognitively demanding test that actually takes up a lot of your brain resources, which may be why it's helpful in unearthing abnormalities, especially in the prefrontal areas. Next slide. When we conceptualize cognitive syndromes like mild cognitive impairment, we don't actually take into account gait abnormalities, or for the most part, most non-cognitive manifestations. So here are a group of 3 participants from one of our Bronx cohorts who've been diagnosed independent of gait assessments into normal amnestic MCI and non-amnestic MCI. And contrary to what many people believe, actually gait abnormalities are quite common in MCI syndromes, especially amnestic MCI, which is considered by many as a precursor to Alzheimer's disease. And way back, original definitions for Alzheimer's disease used the presence of gait abnormality as an exclusion criteria, which has been subsequently removed. But in this particular sample, actually the highest prevalence of neurological gait abnormalities due to strokes or frontal disease or Parkinson's were actually the highest in amnestic MCI when it's diagnosed independently of gait abnormalities. The gait speed also shows a similar pattern in that it's slower in patients with MCI. So it's not surprising that there are gait impairments, both clinical and quantitative, in early stages of cognitive decline. Next slide. So to summarize some of these findings, walking depends on preserved brain structure and function. So when you start getting impairments as you get older due to either vascular pathology or Alzheimer's pathology, and since gait and cognition are interlinked, perhaps it's not surprising that you start seeing subtle clinical abnormalities, which over time become more manifest, but also subtle quantitative assessments show, such as instrumented walkways that we showed impairments and declines in gait parameters, not just gait speed, but other parameters like stride length. You've heard some of it in the earlier session. And from our work, it seems that gait impairments, both clinical and quantitative, are seen early in the course of dementia. So this sets up the next section where I'm going to talk about motoric cognitive risk syndrome. So if I could have the next slide. Now, I'm sure all of you are familiar with mild cognitive impairment syndrome and the criteria for it. So you need subjective cognitive complaints, you need objective cognitive impairments, preserved activities of daily living. And since it's a pre-dementia syndrome, you should not have dementia. And it's widely used in the US. It's a clinically billable diagnosis. If you diagnose MCI, you actually get paid for making that diagnosis. But implementing MCI has some practical issues in that. And the main issue, it has to do with objective cognitive testing, which varies from site to site. So I dare say if we were in a room together and I asked aloud, which test do you use to diagnose MCI, I'm sure there might be 10, 20 different variants of tests that people use. So we're talking conceptually about the same syndrome, but implementing it, it's difficult. The other problem that we face in many settings, like where I work in the Bronx or in India, it's difficult to do detailed neuropsychological testing because of lack of availability of trained staff. Next slide. Now, we know that from the earlier slides that I showed that Gait gets impaired early in the course of dementia. So here's some work from Jeff Kay's group in Portland, Oregon, where they followed a group of people who went on to develop MCI. And it turned out for many years before they were diagnosed with MCI, they had gait speed assessments. And as you can see from the slide, the gait speed starts declining many years before people get diagnosed with MCI. So decline in gait speed is a very early marker. Now, I'm not saying that gait speed is necessarily a better cognitive test than cognitive tests. If you take a sensitive cognitive marker, reaction time, it probably would show the same pattern, but it might be a bit more difficult to access. Next slide. So building on these findings, we proposed a syndrome almost 8-9 years ago, where we kept the same criteria as MCI, but just changed one criteria. Instead of requiring cognitive tests, we said if somebody had slow gait, then they met this criteria. We had initially called this motoric MCI, but in the journal where the study was published, or we at least tried to get it published, they said that seemed a bit unseemly to call it motoric MCI because you're using a motoric sign to diagnose a cognitive impairment syndrome. I tried to convince them unsuccessfully that motor function is a cognitive function. You can't walk without a brain. But I lost. So that's how we landed up with motoric cognitive risk syndrome, where the abbreviation sounds similar to MCI, but it is not MCI. Now, at the outset, I've got to say, this is not set up as a competition to MCI. This is not set as an alternative way of diagnosing risk. It's a complementary method. So in settings where you can't diagnose MCI, but you have access to a clinician, it's easy to diagnose MCR and identify at-risk people. Next slide. We initially tested this out in the Einstein aging study based in the Bronx, and we showed that people who met criteria for MCR had high risk for dementia, especially vascular dementia. But this comes with a major caveat. In this particular study, you only met criteria for MCR if you did not meet criteria for MCI. So these are pure MCR cases who are not mixed in with a concomitant MCI diagnosis. If you don't have that restriction, then it does predict Alzheimer's disease as well. So this was very exciting. We published it. We thought it was a marker for vascular cognitive impairment and vascular dementia. Next slide. But the next thing we wanted to study is this something that's unique to the Bronx, or does the syndrome exist in other parts of the world? So we set up on the study, which involved 22 sites in 17 countries. That's Emily Ayres, my project manager, who spent a year collecting the data. It's good to have friends around the world who are willing to share data. That's always helpful. Next slide. And what we found, and this is Felix Wang, our statistician, who's worked with me for now almost like 15 years, and we found approximately 1 in 10 older adults has the syndrome. Here are many of the investigators, some of whom you may recognize, who participate in the study. But the prevalence varies. So right at the top, you could see a study based in Australia where the prevalence is only about 2%. But this is a healthy community living sample. And I don't know, Australians, you guys are generally much more healthier and more active, I think. So in a study that's somewhere down in the middle, you could actually see the prevalence in Kerala, which is in South India, in the study where I'm involved in. And the prevalence there is 15%, because there we were recruiting from a neurology clinic where you expect a high degree of disease. So generally in community-based studies like MCI, you expect to see a lower prevalence. In clinic-based samples, you expect to see a higher prevalence. But globally, roughly 1 in 10 people meet this criteria. And as you can see at the bottom of the slide, it's subsequently these prevalences have been validated in multiple countries independently. Next slide. And this is to answer the question also, why have another syndrome? And MCR and MCI actually in this global study only had a 39% overlap, which means that either syndrome is not capturing the full pool of at-risk people. So if you only use MCI, you miss a lot of people who are converting to dementia. If you use only MCR, the converse. And so that's why I want to reemphasize the point that this is considered a complementary and not an alternative approach to MCI or VCI for that matter. Next slide. And in studies done mostly in US, but increasingly in other parts of the world, an interesting phenomenon emerges that in our original study, we said that MCR predicts vascular dementia, but in these multiple studies where dementia, this is a clinical diagnosis of dementia, the dementia subtype that was diagnosed was actually Alzheimer's disease. And this might have to do with the disconnect between the clinical and pathological syndromes of Alzheimer's disease, where in older adults, especially the older you get, mixed pathology is common. So it could be that MCR is picking up the vascular component, or it might indeed be picking up the Alzheimer component as well. So this is an area of research that still needs to be pursued. Next slide. So to summarize this section, MCR syndrome is common in aging. 1 in 10 older adults has it. It's a clinically, it's an assay with high clinical utility. You basically just need to ask questions about cognitive complaints and see somebody walk, and it's at high risk for dementia. What about the underlying pathology? If I could have the next slide. So here is a summary of a few studies that have been done. So in a study done from France, investigators said that patients with MCR tended to have smaller volumes in the prefrontal areas as well as the hippocampal areas, suggesting that it might have an influence both on neurodegenerative as well as vascular pathologies. In the study that we did in India, it was an interesting finding. When we looked at cerebral small vessel disease, there were cortical microbleeds, lacunar infarctions, and just white matter hyperintensities. We found that lacunar infarctions, especially in the frontal area, were associated with the presence of MCR, or motoric cognitive risk syndrome, and this was using MRI. In the same study, white matter hyperintensities were not related to MCR. But at least in a poster presentation based on the ARIC study in US, in the recent Alzheimer's Association meeting, AIC, investigators suggested that in the ARIC study, the white matter hyperintensities were actually related to presence of MCR. So I think this brings up an interesting concept that doesn't apply just to MCR, but applies to the whole vascular field of population stratification, that many of the risk factors that have been studied have been reported in Western populations in more developed countries. And while there is increasing work from Asia and other less developed parts in low middle income countries, there's still much more work to be done because some of these risk factors work differently. The cortical microbleeds have been established to be associated with cognitive impairment in Western populations, but as I just mentioned, in India, it wasn't. And the same with white matter hyperintensities. So I think there's not only a need to understand more about vascular pathology in relation to cognitive impairment, but also to study it across different populations to see if these risk factors work the same way in different populations. Next slide. When we look at polygenic risk scores, which is an amalgamation of the risk associated with individual SNPs and then combined together under different clinical phenotypes. With regards to MCR, we see that two vascular-related phenotypes are the ones that come out most significant: body mass index as well as waist circumference. So potentially linking it again, MCR, to a vascular pathology. But then we do also know that these risk factors also are now increasingly being studied in the context of Alzheimer's risk. So it does provide some insights, but again, more work to be done. Next slide. We've set up a consortium that involves sites in the US, Japan, Canada, and Australia to try and, funded by the National Institutes of Health, to try and understand some of the biology. So hopefully you'll be hearing more about some of these findings in more detail from these studies. Next slide. So here's to summarize some of the risk factors for a motoric cognitive risk syndrome. And if you could broadly divide them into modifiable and non-modifiable, you hear some of the risk factors that have been discussed in terms of VCI. So the non-modifiable, age certainly is a risk factor for all pre-dementia and dementia syndrome. But education, which could be a marker for cognitive reserve, is also a risk factor. But among the modifiable, we see stroke, obesity, and interestingly, depressive symptoms. There's increasing interest in these non-cognitive manifestations, which I think are really fascinating. From our group, we've reported it's not depressive symptoms, but actually apathy, which is which sometimes is studied as a subset of depressive symptoms that's associated with MCR and other pre-dementia syndromes. Next slide. I'm just going to briefly talk about some of intervention possibilities. And the one area that I've been really interested in for a long time is the role of cognitive stimulating activities and physical activities. And this paper is over 10 years old, so you'd see that the VCI definition might be a bit dated. But we did try different definitions of VCI in the study. But overall, what we found is that participation in cognitive stimulating activities was not associated with reduced risk of VCI in older, was associated with reduced risk of VCI in older adults, but not physical activities. And I gave an example of what it takes to get you into that high range of cognitive activities, and it's not much. If you just read the newspaper for 5 days, do crossword puzzles for 2 days, and play bridge or chess or any other board game for 1 day, you get to that point. So it really doesn't take much. In this particular study, the more you did, the better it was, though. If you increase your cognitive activities, the risk was further reduced. Next slide. So to summarize, MCR is basically any older patient who presents to you with slow gait and cognitive complaints. And when you think in that in a clinical context, it's just a couple of questions like I've put up here to ask patients about what their cognitive status is, and watching people walk. I tell my trainees when they ask what is slow gait, I think ideally you should measure it and then determine what's slow gait. But generally, if you think somebody's walking slow, they are walking slow, because we are so insensitive to change as clinicians that by the time we pick up somebody's walking slow, they probably meet quantitative criteria for walking slow. So it just takes probably less than a minute to diagnose somebody with MCR if you know they don't have dementia. Next slide. So I'd like to thank you for the patience, but I just would end with an observation. We take walking for granted. But we're not like gazelles or antelopes in the African savanna plains that as soon as we're born, we're ready to run. It takes us about a year to learn how to walk. And so it's probably not surprising at the other end of the age spectrum, when you get older and diseases progress in your brain, that you start seeing some of these gait impairments emerging. And in that slippery slope, I consider gait as an early marker, a canary bird of what can happen down the line. So it's not only important from diagnosis, but from an intervention point, it's helpful for diagnosing and channeling people for interventions. So thank you for your patience, for listening, and like the announcer in cabaret, I just have to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are.
Thank you, Joe, for a fascinating talk and for introducing this concept to those of us who haven't heard of it, but convincing those who have. So if there are any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat box. And in the meanwhile, maybe I'll just start off. So have you looked at which aspect of the other cognitive functions like memory or executive function actually correlate with gait? Do you think there's a relationship between any particular cognitive function and gait?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So in general, if you're looking at quantitative variables of gait like speed or stride length, speed generally goes along with executive functions. And that's why I think you also pick it up on doing tests like walking while talking, because that strains executive functions. But if you look at gait, it has a number of variables, and speed is only one aspect of it. And if I saw a post, I think the last poster in the previous session, where they used the domain approach, I think that we had proposed many years ago, dividing gait performance into different domains like rhythm, pace, and variability. Then you start seeing associations with other cognitive functions. So for instance, rhythm is associated with poor memory function. And it actually did predict Alzheimer's disease in our original paper that we had used this concept in. So it depends on which aspect of gait you're studying. So there are certain, for the most part, though, though gait does go along with executive function, there are certain aspects of gait where it does go along with memory functions too.
Right. Thank you. So we have some questions in the chat box. So one of the questions is, what do you think of the concept of slowing as a syndrome, connecting slowing and walking, that is gait speed, with slowing in thinking, that's processing speed, and slowing in mood, that is apathy?
Yeah, so I think there was actually a conference that was titled that, Thinking, Feeling, and Moving. We had an NIH workshop on that. So I think a lot of those go together. In the motoric cognitive risk syndrome, there's obviously the slowing of walking, and there's slowing of thinking in terms of cognitive complaints. We do know with respect to MCR that depressive and apathy syndromes, which is slowing of mood, are a risk factors. And I think Lou Lipset's group from Boston actually did describe this conjunction of these three syndrome signs together as a high risk for dementia. So I think they do go together.
Thank you. So the questions are coming in fast. Have you been able to see how many of these MCR patients may have peripheral neuropathy, either caused by diabetes or other factors that may influence gait speed, as well as vascular risk factors? I'm sure you've heard this before.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So first of all, gait speed, irrespective of the cause, even if you think it's not due to a neurological disease and it's due to a non-neurological disease like arthritis, it still is a risk factor for dementia in epidemiological studies. And there are many reasons for that, because one is arthritis is ubiquitous. So if you ask older people if they have a bit of ache and pain in their knees or ankles, a lot of them would say yes. I would say yes myself. And neuropathy often goes with, as all of you know, with disease in the brain as well. So neuropathy certainly does slow down somebody, but it also would be associated with cerebrovascular disease. So it's a risk factor as well as a marker for other risk factors as well. So yeah, we do see it. Neuropathy itself, neuropathic gait itself in studies we've looked at hasn't actually predicted dementia. It does predict falls. It along with unsteady gait is a strong predictor of falls.
So I'll just ask one more question. So you have two people in the audience asking you about normal pressure hydrocephalus. So have you looked at ventricular volume, or do you think they may have had incipient NPH?
Yes, I think that certainly is, a factor in MCR, but I don't think it explains all of MCR going by our other brain morphology studies that we see. We do clinically, when we see patients, do assess for the possibility of NPH, but in our research studies, just going by ventricular volume, that is a factor, but not a major factor. But as we might run out of time, I just want to say, my email's available, and I see a lot of very interesting questions.
Lots of very interesting.
So
So Raj,
please,
should we take one more question, or should we stop?
No, I think we can carry on. It's okay.
Yeah.
And I was just going to say, just email me. I'm happy to have a discussion. It's great. Thank you.
So there's one more question on, I was also wondering, so is MCR more likely to lead to synucleinopathies or Alzheimer's disease pathology or Tau disease, Parkinson's disease? So I think.
So this is where I'm going out on a limb, and I really don't have much evidence. So I conceptualize MCR the same way as MCI, that it's a risk state that has many underlying pathologies. And I think part of what we need to do is define subtypes of MCR. And I think there's some subtypes that might actually lead to Alzheimer's disease where the underlying pathology might be tau pathology or amyloid pathology, because there's increasingly work that suggests that amyloid deposition in the brain, especially in the frontal areas, is associated with slow gait. And there might be other MCR subtypes that lead you down to a vascular pathway. We have to consider that MCI as a concept was proposed about 40, 50 years ago. And when I was training and when I was a faculty member, and to date, I still have to explain what MCI is to people outside of, a very learned audience like this. A lot of primary care people still are not, familiar with the concept, and you have to teach them what that is. MCR has only been around for 9 years, so there are a lot of questions to be answered and a lot of dissemination to be done. So, I think one of these is, what are MCR subtypes? What are the pathologies, and what can we do to intervene? So I think it's sort of an exciting area and a lot of work to be done. And I would encourage, there are a lot of junior investigators over here to look into it. And, if you have questions, reach out to me.
Right. So the last comment is from Hugh Marcus. He says it's an interesting talk. And I was interested in that you found apathy, but not depressive symptoms related, and he says he has also found apathy, but not depressive symptoms related to white matter network damage. Do you think this might be related to Gait as well?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I have to confess that I wasn't really, so cognizant of the distinction between apathy and depressive syndromes until this mentee of mine, who's a geriatric psychiatrist, started working with me, both in a clinical setting as well as research, and started teaching me about apathy, because, as you know, the interventions for apathy and depression are different. The medications for depression don't necessarily work in apathy. And that's what led to investigating apathy as a separate syndrome. And in fact, in the study that we're doing in India, that's one of the major risk factors we're looking at is apathy, because in South India, using traditional depressive scales, there's a high level of depressive symptoms on, say, the geriatric depression scale, but some of it might be apathy. So we are looking into this more, and I thank you for that question. And I think, yes, I think these networks might be the ones that are common both to apathy as well as gait dysfunction.
Thank you, Joe. And with this, we thank you very much for a very fascinating talk, and for the audience for very active participation. With this, we end the session.